We're going to hear from Harry Veryser. You folks, you know Dr. Veryser. He's a great Austrian economic scholar, very well known and very knowledgeable. And he's going to be talking tonight about tariffs. What are they and what aren't they? There's a lot of discussion about that right now. It's a hot topic, and Harry agreed to come. In fact, here's a nice little tidbit. When I called to speak to Harry about this on the cell phone a few weeks ago, I noticed that all of a sudden the dial tone changed. I said, it sounds like it's when somebody's overseas. And so I got a phone call back from Harry Veryser calling from Shanghai. And I said, hey, honey, Harry Veryser called me from Shanghai. But not many people can say that. She was one of his former students at Walsh, you see. So she was impressed by that. But Harry's going to talk about this. But anyway, we're very glad to see all of you here tonight. This is a wonderful group that gets together. And with that, I'd like to turn the meeting now over to Harry Veryser to tell us about tariffs, what they are, what they aren't, and what's happened in the past and what the implications are for what's going on now. Dr. Harry Veryser, everybody.
As we talk about tariffs, number one is that a tariff is a tax normally. Now, a lot of times the word is used. I get a little bit more. Okay. A tariff is sometimes used just as a general tax, but normally it refers to a tax at the border, import or export, that there's a certain amount charged. Now, in the Constitution, there's no export tariff in the United States. There's only import tariffs, okay? As the Founding Fathers were very, they had read Adam Smith, they were aware of the arguments for free trade, and they wanted to make sure that Americans could always export their manufactured goods. And the concept was if you did not have external tariffs, it would make it far easier for American to export goods. Now, mainly we exported, and we still do, mainly agricultural stuff. So we talk about America as an export country. I'll show you what we do export. So we define, let's see, get this going. Let's see if this thing, everything's working. Okay, this is I left, you're going to have this, I guess he'll send it out to you. But the tariff is a tax or duty on charges, government charges to come in or out of a country. Now, if you go to Hong Kong, you have to pay a tariff to get out. There's no tariff to get in, but you got to keep about $5 or something. They'll warn you at the border that you have to have that to get in or out. Now, there are I get this thing right? Okay. There are two types of tariffs. There's a revenue tariff and a protectionist tariff. And it was the major argument between John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, okay? Because when the new republic was founded, remember, every government has to have a revenue source, because as Edmund Burke said, a government is its revenues. It doesn't do anything without revenues. So the original Founding Fathers wanted to have, especially Adams, and Adams did not get along at all with Hamilton. Adams said, well, let's just have a tariff coming in, which would be generally flat across the board. Regardless what you brought in, there was a tariff on it. It'd be relatively low. It'd be like a sales tax. Today, the Cayman Islands has a revenue tariff. Whatever you bring in, that's 20%, but there's no other taxes, okay? And so the concept was that the tariff would support the government because there was hardly any sources of revenue prior to that, especially a revenue in bullion, in gold. So the Founding Fathers said, well, we will have a tariff, but it'll be a regular tariff. It was Alexander Hamilton who came up with the idea of a protective tariff. In other words, a tariff now that would favor certain industries over others. And this was a big debate that went on, and this, I think now, is still going on inside the government, where Trump tends to favor protective tariffs, although I'll explain what I think his strategy is in just a minute on the tariff issue. Okay? This chart here gives you an idea of the tariffs being charged by various countries. And if you notice, America is down, we're about, I guess you can't quite see that, but you'll have to get it on the internet, I guess, or whatever. Will you get it on the internet? Can you get to it on the internet? I mean, you'll send it to them, right?
For the sake of the audience, the U.S. is right here.
Okay. Okay, you'll be my, as Bishop Sheen once had, my angel, right? Okay, so I'll be calling on you. But the U.S. is one of the low tariff countries. In other words, for all intents and purposes, the United States is a free trade country. Average tariffs are around 4%. Okay, China is almost a free trade country too, and so for most of since the Bretton Woods Agreement, protective tariffs or high tariffs have sort of gone by the board. Okay, even with the Trump tariffs, as you'll see, they're hardly a blip in the tariff thing in the world. Okay, now you can see the countries in Africa have very, very high tariffs. So the United States, we're a low tariff country. Ever since Bretton Woods, we've been relatively free trade. Okay, China does not have the highest tariffs. And if you'll notice, if I weren't glued to this chair for that camera, I could go out and point to it, but you could see, could my angel come up maybe? Okay, and maybe you could point to where China stands among them.
China is in the kind of orange there.
Oh, it's orange. And
the United States right below it.
Yeah, the United States right below. So China is not.
Brazil.
Yeah, Brazil and India are much higher. And I have to tell you, it's far easier for me to get in and out of China than it is for me to get in and out of Canada. Oh yeah, I mean, what's being put out about China is a little different than the reality. But I mean, you just go in, you issue your passport, they stamp it, and there you go. I mean, you have to fill out a form, and you go. When you come out, when you come back, you give the form back to them, they stamp it. You go through the search, but they don't have that big search apparatus. They just have the metal detector, and the biggest export most people take with them is tea. So I mean, there's not as big a deal as Canada. I got all kind of questions last time I went. Just going to Stratford, where are you going, how are you going, what hotel you're staying in, all the rest of it. Coming back to the United States, a big bunch of questions. Not in China. Relatively easy country to go in and out of, okay? How tariffs work. Now, the way the protective tariff works is this. A tariff is a cost, okay? And what happens is it adds to the cost of the purchase. So what the concept was is if you had two industries, one in, say, China, or one in Germany, or one in France, or one in England, and it was more efficient than the American industry. In order to bring the industries into competition, what you do is you charge a higher tariff on the more competitive country. Okay? So the idea of the tariff was to equalize cost. Well, for economists, this is crazy because we're looking to do what? To expand your choices. Okay? So what happens is economists have what they call the income situation where it really lowers your income. That's what the tariffs do. So it really, in a sense, is designed to protect home industries, but to protect you from the advantage of having lesser goods. Yeah.
When say a president in that situation, with the foreign companies, with the foreign countries making the better product and our product not being that good, that the president will slap that protective tariff on for a certain amount of time, let's say 5, 7, or 10 years, and tell the industry, hey, you have a certain amount of time to get your act together.
Well, that's normally the theory.
Yeah.
The problem is what happens in politics is once you get something going, everybody's down there lobbying against changing it. Okay? That's the big problem. Okay? I mean, so that's the problem. But this was the concept between the two tariffs. Now, the protective tariff, that's to equalize, or even not more than equalize, but actually to prevent the competition from foreign goods and services. Okay, this is the example of a protective tariff. We are paying a good deal more for sugar than foreign countries are, okay? If you take a look at the world price of sugar, there, maybe you could read it, Dennis. The world price of sugar, the red.
31.68 cents.
And what are we paying here in the United States?
56.22.
Okay, so what we're doing is we're paying almost, say, 60, 70% more for sugar. Now, you might say, oh, well, that's fine. But what happens is the candy makers have moved offshore Okay, they used to be in Chicago. They've all moved to Canada to take advantage of lower sugar prices. So what happens is, I had one economist, Dr. Malliott, and he was quite a character at U of D, and he says the problem with economics is you push in here and it pops out there. In other words, as you're trying to manipulate the economy, you're going to do something over here, it's going to move over there.
Can I explain?
Pardon?
I own a store. They didn't change to Canada. What they've done is replace sugar with corn syrup.
Corn syrup, yeah.
Corn syrup is killing people. But this thing is killing people.
Yeah. Yes, Janet?
Why is, tell me again, why is America paying a higher price for sugar? We're imposing a tariff on other countries' sugar coming into our country?
Because we make the sugar here from sugar beets, which is a far more expensive process than sugar cane. So what we could do is buy it on world markets, but there's a tariff on that. So we've replaced it with corn syrup, or some of the candy makers have actually, I think one went to Canada. I forget the name of the company.
If you look at a Snickers bar, it's got corn syrup in it. It doesn't have any.
Somebody didn't move. I remember reading about that. But also,
All the soft drink companies are corn syrup.
so there are sugar people that pull the sugar
Sure.
beets or whatever. They wanted the tariff, right?
Sure. I mean, our congressman, Dave Bonnier, is no longer, fortunately, in Congress, okay? He was known as a sugar daddy. And he was paid enormous amounts of money in his campaign to keep the sugar tariff on, okay? And, I mean, it means like a multiple $1 million subsidy to the sugar producers or to whatever else to keep this tariff on. And of course, this is typical of protectionism. This is one of the problems with protectionism. Okay, this is just an example. Okay, this is the height of tariffs over the history of the Republic. As we go back to 1820, we had a very, very high tariff. Tariffs are about 50% at that point, okay? And then, by the way, it did cause a pretty severe downturn in the economy. Most of these tariffs they do cause depressions, and they do cause stock market problems. I know myself, a friend of mine, I gave this lecture. Well, as soon as he heard the word tariff, he sold all of his stock. He said they're going to come down. Well, we'll see what happens. But if you take a look at the next point, that's the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And that was about 50 or 60%. It was one of the chief reasons for World War II. If you wanted me to give a lecture sometime on the causes of that war and where it came from, this is a big one. But after the war, the economists of the world got together and said, hey guys, we can't continue having this. Because what happened was, when you put the I'll give you a quick thing, a quick explanation of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. When you put that on, all the other countries retaliated, and world trade collapsed. Well, you got a number of countries who depend on world trade. One was Germany, one was Japan, one was England, or I guess the British Empire then. Well, the British had an empire to get goods and services from. The Germans did not. The German economy collapsed. The Japanese, the liberal, what we call the more liberal or moderate party, was shoved out by the military, and immediately you had the thing that if we can't trade for the goods, we know another way to get them, and that was war. Okay, and the history of that is so evident. So we get into after World War. Okay.
Slideshow.
Now, they met at a place called Bretton Woods. In 1933, Herbert Hoover called the Economic Conference of the World, and what the Brits said, we know where this is going. Okay, this is going to war in 1933. And they called the London Economic Conference, and they said, we have to go back to the gold standard, and we have to restore free trade. Now, had they done that, and I have quotes in my book, Roosevelt's foreign minister or secretary of state then said that would have ended, that the World War II did not begin in September of 1939. It began in July 12, 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt blew up the economic conference. Okay, it was all settled. Everything was done. Roosevelt said, we're not going along with it. He sat on his yacht and made some decision doing that. Okay, well, he might have been a brilliant guy in World War II, but all these guys, they fixed the mess they caused and left a bigger mess behind. Okay? So what happened in 1944-45, they established the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and they restored the gold standard. The dollar was convertible into gold, $35 an ounce, and that led to the prosperity that you had even today. Okay, so tariffs, you can see tariffs were really a minor part of the thing. It's interesting, Keynes was one of the economists who was there, and then when Nixon broke the gold standard, he says, I'm a Keynesian now. Well, he obviously did not know his history. I mean, okay, lots of things he didn't know. But in any event, the GATT objectives, the General Agreed Trade and Tariffs, raising the standard of living, ensuring full employment, the volume of real income and whatever, really took off. Developing full use of resources, and it was to bring up greater productivity down. Okay, this is the trade wars going on now. We're talking about the protectionism versus that. Now, if you take a look at it, this is I should probably had a darker room, but this is the top stuff that we export, okay? I'll just sort of mention it. Our chief exports to China are airplane parts, medicine, and agricultural products, okay? Now, when you enact tariffs, and there's responsibility, the place it hits is the agricultural area. The farmers are really suffering, and I'll show you the statistics coming out on it. I don't know how, I mean, he's got to resolve this pretty quickly. Okay, I'll show you what's happening. This is the Chinese products that that are targeted by Trump. Okay, he's targeting their products. By the way, we get very little steel from China. I'll go through that as we go through. Mainly the stuff is manufactured goods, that kind of thing, which he's targeting. Well, they're retaliating. Okay, since you're going to get this in the email, China announced that they are retaliating against our tariffs. And I'll go into some of the reasons he's doing it.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Could you please focus on Harry here. Thank you.
Okay. What happens is that this is China's response, and of course stocks fell, and their stock market fell too. Okay, much higher. Okay, Mexico's tariffs, stock prices fall, gold rises. Okay, this is what we expect. The import of the Mexican tariffs, if they continue, will raise the price of a car about $1,500. Now, one of the things people have to understand is that the supply chain to make cars or anything is worldwide now. Okay, at one time it was just here in the United States, but now if you take a car, and I showed my students, I had a graph. I said, look, do you want to know what goes into a car? Okay, all over the world parts are going into it. So when you put a tariff on, all of a sudden it just doesn't hit this, it moves across the board. We're no longer in a situation where we can do this. That's why tariffs all over the world are going down, because all the countries realize the intricacy of the supply chain for everything. Okay? Now, this is the tariffs by various products. If you'll notice, this is where it's going to hit the most. This is the number of bankruptcies that are going on right now among the farms. Okay, this is now, remember, when you put a tariff on, what's going to happen is the farmers are going to sell less cotton, wheat, whatever, right? Because they're going to export less, which means their income's going to go down. They're going to get closer or below break-even point. They're going to start to eat up their capital, and they're going to start having bankruptcies. Now, I can tell you this happened to me with the Bush steel tariffs. Okay? In 2000, whenever, Bush put on the steel tariff to protect the steel industry, of which is crazy, but anyway, I'll tell you why in a minute. Our price of our product, of our stamping product, price of steel went up 50%. You can't pass 50% on the Generous Motors or anybody else, and we couldn't. And I can take you into Detroit and show you company after company of steel fabricator that was forced into bankruptcy by the Bush tariffs. Okay, we were very lucky because we were able to cut it. You know, we were able to cut cost enough, but it meant my brothers and I practically going out salaries and cutting. We didn't want to lay the employees off because of that Bush steel tariff. Okay, so I know what these farmers are going through. Because what's happening is, if you take a look at, this is Trump, and he says, notice, he says, take that, China. Well, he has this beam, and he's hitting the pork farmers on one hand and the soybean farmers on the other. So this is having an effect on the farm community. And a lot of folks think, oh, well, we'll just put the tariff on. It doesn't have any effect. Oh, no. You push in here, something pops out there. All right? Okay? That is where the corn production by county is. Corn farmers are really going to get hit with this thing, right? That's all the Trump area where his voters are. That's why he says he's got to reverse this. Okay? This is this is Trump's county. They carried it in that district, the farm district. Okay? And this shows you what's happened to the corn prices. Okay, all of these prices, what happened was this. You announce you're going to have a tariff, right? They know, what do we export? Agricultural stuff. Okay, we are the Saudi Arabia of food. Okay, so what happens is all these farmers are producing, and suddenly the market dries up. The futures market dries up, because the futures tell you right away. So what happens? Kabang! All this is thrown on the market, the prices come down, and guess what? The farmers no longer can sell their stuff, and they're going into bankruptcy. Okay, so this is one of the, and I saw this happen in my own industry, the metal stamping industry. Okay, what happened in that one? All right. I'm still trying to get some of my nephews to vote Republican after that one, but okay. All right, this is the tariffs being paid in U.S. companies. If you'll notice, just as the tariff companies now are paying about $6.2 billion. It will eat into their profits, not significantly, but it will still eat into their profits because it's increasing cost. Okay, the forever trade war. We talked about the steel tariffs, which is protecting steel here, but we are, folks, you realize that we're only producing 25%? We import about another 60 to 70% of our steel from overseas, okay? And the steel we're producing is not generally the full time, it's these mini malls. But we're importing most of our steel.
Why?
Because of the fact of the cost of steel production here was so high.
So isn't that in effect?
Well, you had...
Brown tax.
Well, here's what you had.
You had the EPA and all the environmental rules and the income tax and everything to our products. It becomes so expensive to do business.
Well,
in the United States, that in effect, that is a reverse tariff.
That's my next slide. That's what I was going to tell you. Now, the problem is you have this legacy cost. Okay, so in the steel industry, for every person, because now we produce steel so much more efficiently, but for every person working on the line, there's 8 or 9 people on the retirement. Yeah. I mean, if you take a look at the city of Chicago, each household owes about $55,000 or $60,000 in taxes just to pay the retirement. And when you add the whole thing up, the Chicago taxes, don't buy property in Chicago because you're buying into a mortgage of $150,000 because we have all these legacy costs built in. Okay, this is by Paul Craig Roberts, who I'm a fan of. I don't know if you ever see his stuff, but he knows what he's talking about. He says we're just protecting a lot of what? A lot of needless regulation. Now, one thing I will say about President Trump is I do admire the fact he's getting rid of the regulation. That has to go. That's nothing but dead weight cost. All this is favoring various interest groups. Yeah.
Dr. Veryser, what do you think of Trump's premise that he's doing this to equalize the marketplace. I mean, that's what fake news we get. I
Yeah.
know the truth.
Well, I think that's what he's thinking, and I think the problem that he has with China is the theft of
Intellectual property.
intellectual property. And I saw that happen, because I assigned a textbook to the kids in class. Well, they got one textbook, Xeroxed it off, and gave it to all the others.
I've heard going ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I watched it, and you have to understand the nature of China. We'll get into that in a bit, the cultural nature. It is different, okay? It is much different than the West. Okay, this is where he put on the things from Mexico. Now, here's my theory on the stuff from Mexico, is Congress is completely ineffective and not functional at all. All they worry about is infanticide and sodomy and some other stuff. That's all they're worried about.
That's it.
They're not doing anything on the economy, except they want to impeach Trump and whatever. Well, because they won't do anything about I guess Mexico is saying that they're holding back 250,000 people from coming to the United States. The American people are demanding something's being done, so he's telling Mexico, hey, boys, you use your army and keep them out of here. You keep them out of Mexico, okay? That's why he's doing it, because he really has no choice, okay? I mean, I understand why. It's the fact that Congress is completely non-functional. I mean, think of it. Their duty under the Constitution, their prime duty is to do one thing: come up with a budget. And they have not been able to come up with a budget. Even Nancy Pelosi just gave up her hands. We can't. I mean, and what you have is you have a Congress whose worry has nothing to do with the economy at all. I mean, it's just absolutely nuts, you know.
Isn't it their job to set the value of money?
Sorry? Yeah, if it's linked to gold. Okay, this is what the tariffs. Okay, this is some of the estimates of the loss of productivity, the loss in sales, the type. They're figuring a tariff, if a tariff increase of about 3.6 percentage points, these are the kind of things you get: loss of productivity, loss in spending, etc. Okay? All right, this is what we import from China. We'll just let that go. Okay, this is our imports from China. I'm going a little bit faster because I can see this. This is our exports to China. He says you'll be able to get this at home, so I'll be able to answer questions. This is the farmers. Okay, round two. Farmers are going to be hurt. The farm industry is going to be hurt.
Well, except that we're subsidizing them now, so we're all paying a tax to bail them out for the effect of the tariff.
Of the tariff.
That's being imposed. The total of which at this point is about equal to Trump's tax cuts in 2017, by the way.
Yeah,
It's the double whammy, Joe Wolf.
double whammy.
Absolutely.
Yes, miss?
Okay, I have a really good friend. She and her husband own a aftermarket car, parts that they.
Sure. Oh, yeah, okay.
The company went to China, so they're forced to buy their stuff from China. She has spent the past month raising their prices 25% because of the tariff.
Yeah, you'll be seeing that. Okay, now this is the steel imports. I put the stuff in steel in here, but no, you're right, that's happening. So I want to just show you, this is the global steel. I'm giving these statistics to you, so when you get home, you can take a look at it and study it, you know, a little bit more, because I want to answer questions. This is China. China produces about 50% of the world's steel, but they don't send that much to us. Most of our stuff is coming from Canada. The steel's coming from Canada. And so now, this is the growth of the Chinese steel industry. And one of the things is that China, after they adopted a market system, the place took off. At the top is a communist operation. No question about it, all right? People disappear, work camps, the whole structure of communism's at the top. At the bottom, they've released the economy, and the growth rate's phenomenal. And if you go to China, you see businesses all over the place. They're very entrepreneurial people, but they're not original people. It's a different, the culture's flat.
They have labor unions?
Pardon?
They have labor unions?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, you're liable to get shot. I mean, you know, you got to understand, you're dealing with a totalitarian country. But it's a totalitarian country with a market, a relatively free market. Okay, now, this is the crude steel production. That gives you ours versus the world. Okay? Now, this is what I wanted to touch on, then I'll answer questions. This shows you what happened after Nixon broke Bretton Woods. We used to export more than we imported in terms of our trade, our balance of trade. Okay, not the balance of payments, because we had to figure in a bunch of foreign aid and other crap in there, other stuff in there. But
This being the point of the break.
about
1971.
1971,
We're on the upside, prior to that, nothing but downside.
down, okay?
Excuse me, and what we're talking about is the last link to the gold.
Yes, yeah, last link to gold. This is what happened in 1968 in order to pay for the Vietnam War, which is a whole nother story. We had to print the money. Mr. Johnson broke the link, the international link to gold, and it repealed the law put into place by George Washington, mandating that the dollar be defined in so many grams of silver. He repealed that. And then Nixon,
Wouldn't that have been taking a constitutional amendment?
it was supposed to,
Should have.
But you know.
Okay.
See, the kind of thing that the Supreme Court was actually.
It was.
Before was to stop that.
5-4 decision went the other way. They were afraid, the Depression. Okay, then Nixon closed the gold window. And then you can see exactly what happened. That was, notice, U.S. balance of trade as a percentage of the total trade. Look what exactly happened. We went into deficit. This is a monetary problem.
And we stayed there ever since.
It's been unstable ever since, okay? Trade in American jobs, it'll just give you an idea of how many jobs are affected, okay? And production is worldwide. That's one of the big problems that he's facing. This shows you an airplane where all the parts come from, all over the world. I mean, it's hard to build anything today without, again, that's another picture of the airplane, worldwide supply chain. Okay, so I thought, that's an opening. I thought I'd spend most of the time answering your questions, if you had any. Most people are always anxious to ask economists questions, so I'm open to this or anything else. Yeah.
So, like in 1935, I think they passed the Warden Act, which forced companies to recognize labor unions.
Yeah, that was the Labor Relations Act. What was it? LaGuardia something.
And then they added the EPA, and they added workers' comp and unemployment insurance and all kinds of regulations. And so 50 years later, the average auto worker is making $78 an hour, and the minimum wage is $7.35. And then they open it up to free trade and think that our manufacturers are going to compete with slave labor in another country.
Or even just inexpensive labor in another country. You don't have to go to the slave market. It's reasonably paid.
Well, the problem was,
When do we correct this situation? I mean, if you have a country with no manufacturing base, how dangerous is that from just a military standpoint? You can't even make a tank in this country, or any bomb, anything, a bullet.
by the way, neither could anybody else. Neither could anybody else.
At what point do you try to reverse that?
Well, let's just go through, let's take one step at a time of your questions. Number one, on the auto industry, okay? There was all kinds of inefficiencies going on in the auto industry. I mean, it was incredible what was going on. And they were paying, and I knew because I was in there. I was an automotive supplier for 27 years, And the problem is that when they monkeying around with the value of the dollar, it became more expensive to import parts, or it became more expensive to do it here because we couldn't get the raw material. We could beat the Chinese in efficiency. I did, but I couldn't beat them on the steel price with that tariff in place, or the U.S. dollar manipulated itself. I mean, I think it's much more, I don't know if all the economists would agree with me, but I think it's much more a thing of monetary manipulation, the breaking of gold. I've studied several, England, Turkey, Spain, and the Roman Empire. everyone that broke the link to gold lost their manufacturing base. That is the thing that did it. And we did it for a war that we should never got into. I mean, I'll just tell you, I've just finished a whole study. I'm reading all the books of the ambassadors. The assassination of Diem in October 1963 collapsed the Vietnamese government. We had to take it over. The Vietnamese looked at us as people who murdered their president. Okay. And then, he came up with this Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never happened. So we have a murder and a lie. We put in a whole bunch of American troops. Now, the official word is 57,000 were killed, right? It's not 57,000, because if you take a look at the number of suicides that you have to add to that, you're approaching 200,000. Okay? So, I mean, you have a war that, the evidence is just phenomenal.
So what was had we lost that war, we'd all be talking Vietnamese right now.
How many Vietnamese died?
Yeah.
Millions.
But anyway, part of it was the breaking of that, the breaking of Bretton Woods. Now, there were technical problems with Bretton Woods. I mean, we could go into a long econ lecture that I'll put you all to sleep. But Bretton Woods was holding back inflation because they had to convert into gold. Okay? And I told my Chinese students, I says, you can't print gold. And I said, you can go into a Chinese bank and there's gold all over the place. The Chinese government is encouraging their citizens to hold gold.
America's found a way to print gold.
Yeah.
We have a way to print gold. We print gold in the...
We have futures contracts and things, yeah. Yes, sir.
Trump's done a 180 on interest rates now. He wants lower and lower interest rates. Do you think that's what he's going to try to do, try to mask the damage from the tariffs?
Well, here's the situation. The American, you've opened up a wide thing. Let me just kind of get into it with you. We've become a financialized economy. So we have fire, we have what's in this economy. Before it was manufacturing. Now what we have is we have finance, we have insurance, we have real estate that's driving it. Those are heavily dependent on interest rates. You start manipulating interest rates, you can cause all kinds of waves in the bond market. You allow them to go up. So I think what happened was, I don't think it's necessarily a big deal for manufacturers as much as it is for these financialized industries. That I think what happened is that they realize interest rates have to go up to balance the supply and demand of capital and to allocate the resources. But as they started to raise it, all these banks and all kind of other people, stock market and everything else, started having real problems. And I think that the Fed fellow went into Trump and said, with the statistics, and said, hey, this is what we're facing, because you start pushing up interest rates, especially now most people have what? Flexible, or what they call adjustable rate mortgages on their house. You can cause some real waves. So now they're going to have to keep interest rates low. Well, how do you do that? You create money, you create credit. And that just makes the problem worse. Gold interest rates, historically, 2 to 3% long-term. Short-term gold rates about 1 to 1.5. But people ask me, well, Harry, can we go back on the gold standard? Oh, yeah, we can do that tomorrow. However, here's the downside of going on gold, all right? That means that you can't print money, so the federal government is running, what, $1 trillion deficit every year? You have to go into the capital markets and borrow that. Well, that would shove interest rates through the roof. So to go on gold, you would have to cut the budget about 25%.
The problem with that is?
No political will. That's the problem.
But I'm just mentioning to you, this is the major problem with it, okay? But I don't see them doing anything to raise interest rates at all. That's too big at the present time, with a fiat money economy, and the amount of debt, 50% of the world's debt is denominated in dollars. I mean, this is a mess that, so they're going to keep them low. That's my prognosis.
Do you see any way to fix this at all?
Yeah, but,
Besides wars?
oh, war's the worst. Don't even think about it.
Revolution.
Oh, rebel. No, I think what will happen is it's going to get to a point. It's going to get to a point that I see a gradual rollback of the state, the interference of the state, because it's failing. Okay, I mean, if you just take a look, I'm on a charter school board. I'm also on a school board of a Catholic school. Well, you start taking a look at the differences in the math scores and the reading scores. You start taking a look at some of this other stuff. The state is failing. Okay, they failed. They failed. I don't know what war they were successful in. You ask me, well, what do you mean? What they said what was going to happen at the end never happened. Right? I mean, you take a look at all these wars, and you take a look at what they said and what the outcome was. So I think the Trump said it. He said, they asked him, they said, what do you think about this guy Bolton? He said, well, if I listened to him, I'd be in 4 wars right now. So I think Trump is trying, I think he's trying to put the brakes on. But I mean, you got what? So let's say there's 250,000 people come in from Central America. Okay, who's going to feed them? Who's going to house them? Who's going to give them medical care? It's going to break the budgets of those states. Okay, just like Chicago. And we're getting to the point where the debt is becoming unmanageable. Okay? Now, that's happened before in history. It happened to England. England came up with the steam engine, became very productive. Okay, because the productivity pushed England into the Industrial Revolution, saved it. The computer saved us. The computer actually saved us. But we've gone so far in doing this that the type of stuff you'd have to do to fix it permanently. So I'm hoping that we can do a gradual fix. Okay, but I do think the dollar will be forced to be on a quasi-gold standard. Okay, I do think that'll happen. Let's see. Oh yeah, the younger fellow. I'll get both of you.
Should we get a new currency?
Well, I don't think it's going to change from the dollar, but I think what they'll do is they'll just at some point, they will either lock the dollar into the price of gold internationally. In other words, they'll say, let's keep the price of gold at $1,200 an ounce or $1,500 an ounce, and we won't print any more. Well, if you do that, you've locked in the gold. So that's one way. You could make, but then if you can buy and sell gold, it's convertible at that price. If we lock it in, it's convertible. So in fact, you have a de facto gold standard. I think that's going to happen, but I don't see a rampant runaway inflation, and then like France or Venezuela or that. I don't see that. I don't see that. Yeah.
Okay. With there are states like California that it would take like one more recession to knock them into insolvency. And what would the full collapse of California's economy and other states like they're not that far behind either.
Yeah.
They can go to China.
Pardon?
They can go to China.
Yeah. The problem is the debt service, how long they'd be able to service the debt and how long before they'd have to start reneging on their bonds. Now, what they would do is because they got all kind of tricks up their sleeve. They'll do anything but do the right thing. Okay. So what I expect would happen is that they would start to renegotiate the bonds, issue longer bonds, trying to stretch the debt out. But you get to a certain point, you become insolvent, and, like Detroit. Thank God for the Art Institute, or for those paintings, and the legislature, in essence, giving them a subsidy for that in Belle Isle. Detroit would have been bankrupt.
Dennis has a question.
Yeah.
I do. So actually, a couple of that comes real quickly. The people at Wave International have studied central banks and the short-term markets, and what they found is that the central banks don't lead the short-term markets. The short-term markets actually lead the central
Oh,
banks.
yeah, that's true.
So it's kind of, the Fed isn't as powerful as we think because they'll just follow along. But
You're right, Dennis. That's absolutely true.
thanks, sir. I made my quota for the day. I got one right. But you showed on the map about the corn production.
Yeah.
And then the earlier chart was interesting. It showed between the tariff of abominations in Calhoun and Jackson and then Smoot-Hawley, there was the mid-19th century, around the time of the War of Federal Aggression during
Yeah.
Southern independence.
Well,
and the high tariffs there.
Yeah.
So, think of it, sectionally, different people, some people are helped, some people are hurt. And wasn't that a big factor back in that day for the agricultural interest in the South and the Midwest?
Well, it hurt the South enormously because the South had to pay more for manufactured goods. And what happened is that it became difficult for the Southerners because if you can't sell here, you can't buy here. So Britain couldn't buy here because of they couldn't sell here. So what they did is they started manufacturing or growing cotton in Egypt and other places, increased the amount of competition for the Southern farmers. It was one of the reasons the South never did rebound. Farmers always have been free trade. Okay, and so Lincoln put on the tariffs to pay for the war, because at that time tariffs were paid in gold, and he needed a supply of gold, including California, to pay the Union debt, to pay for the war. So that's why there were the high tariffs. So then, after that, the tariff became the political issue between the Republicans and Democrats. And the Democrats at that time were low tariff. They represented the South and the West. And the Republicans were high tariff. They represented New England, Pennsylvania, the manufacturers. And so that went on until about, you started having repercussions, and that went on to the Cleveland administration when he was a Democrat. Now, he was the last official kind of Democrat. The rest of them, after Woody, turned socialist. But Cleveland was working to bring those tariffs down because he understood that.
And then what about Cobden and Bright in England? People might find that interesting, what they did and how it really helped the British.
Oh my gosh, yes. It was the reason for the British prosperity.
Right. What they do with tariffs?
Yeah, what happened was the average English person was paying because of the high tariffs, would not allow American grain to come into England or any other grain. And they did this because of Napoleon, but they never repealed it. The average English person was paying something like 30 to 50%, depending on of their income, to eat. Now, that's why they're all coming here, because food was cheaper. And I always tell my students, I said, what's the basis of prosperity? And they all say manufacturing and agriculture. Now, why? Because Americans are, you take a look, I didn't put that in here, but Americans pay 6% of their income for food. That means you got 94% to spend on other stuff. You take a look at Egypt or Africa, they're paying 50%. Well, that means half of their work is going into eating, and the rest of it's going into whatever. So I put a chart on the board. I had the chart up there, and I said the productivity of agriculture, because it lowers the cost of food, releases income for all kinds of other stuff. All right? So I have one fellow, Italy is about 12%. So I pointed to the class, I said, well, Italy, look at this, 12%. They said, yeah, but Italian food's twice as good. Twice as good.
So, but Cobden and Bright,
Yeah.
the story in the Corn Laws and the
Yeah.
Anti-Corn Law League, I think people would find that interesting.
Yeah, what happened was they had to bring, I mean, if you take a look at England, you see they were building all these great big, magnificent country houses because the nobles owned the land. Okay, so they were selling this stuff and making a tremendous profit, so they're building beautiful structures. Okay, well, Cobden and Bright said, well, they're paying 50%, 30 to 50% of their income for food, depending on how you calculate it. And so they repealed the Corn Laws. The food price did what? Immediately dropped. And the income level of the average Englishman went right up. Because why? They were paying a lot less for food, and that meant they had money to buy other stuff. Okay? And so the repeal of the Corn Laws is a very important thing. Very important thing. Okay.
And they had a great prosperity after that, right?
Yeah, prosperity after
They
that.
didn't wait for other countries to lower their tariffs, right? They
No.
did it unilaterally, and then other countries followed when they saw how
Yeah.
good it was for England.
Yeah.
Didn't Lincoln print a lot of fiat currency to pay for that war?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So how did he justify that? How did
Well, he said he wanted to borrow the money from the Rothschilds.
Right.
But they wanted 15%. So he said, well, I didn't pay that. So what they did is they issued promissory notes, which is fiat money.
Yeah.
But I'll have to say this, the Union, after the economy expanded so much, they were able to redeem the dollars in gold. So they did redeem it in gold. Okay, but it was like 1879, 14 or 15 years later, that they finally did that. But then you had the National Bank Act, which was the progenitor of the Federal Reserve, and you had all kinds of problems with that. And then later, the Fed.
Yeah.
I got a quote from Wilson that he regretted signing the Fed. I finally found out. He said I did the wrong
It was
thing.
the worst thing he had done in his time in office, which is saying a lot, frankly.
For what he did.
He didn't even say that, but
I think,
Wilson, yeah.
by all accounts, I think he had to be one of the worst presidents, responsible for more deaths, at least 50 to 100 million people, because of the flu epidemic that was released.
and casting a long shadow in history.
Yep, World War II.
Yes, sir. I'll have to get going in a bit, but
That's because World War I, because how World War I ended the way it did. It turns out that if we not get involved in World War I, the chances are it would have ended in stalemate.
yes. Had been better off. He and his friends had no concept of unintended consequences. Had no concept of that. He was an arrogant, they say pretty racist guy. Thought he had a PhD. I advise everybody, if one of the reasons I did not vote for what's the guy who was Speaker of the House? Gingrich. He had a PhD, so I voted the other guy. I said, we had one of those before.
But PhDs in physics are good. My dad has one, I gotta say that.
Okay, any other questions, folks?
Harry, thank you very much. Wasn't that
It's
great?
enjoyable coming.